I was in my office reviewing budget reports, looking over the numbers for the third quarter, when I suddenly heard loud screams. At first, I thought one of the peacocks had gotten loose again, or maybe a child had fallen near the monkey exhibit, but the screams grew louder and soon turned into full-blown panic. I ran toward the sound and literally froze in place when I saw a scene that could have been a real nightmare. A massive adult lion was running down the main path between visitors. People scattered in terror. Mothers grabbed their children and ran toward the exit. A father shoved his family into the gift shop and slammed the door, and an elderly couple froze at the fence of the flamingo enclosure, afraid to move. The lion hadn't harmed anyone yet, but the situation was threatening to become the worst disaster in Riverside Zoo's history. I grabbed the radio and screamed into it, demanding immediate evacuation of visitors and a team with tranquilizers, then rushed toward the big cat enclosure to understand how this could have happened. The massive metal door to Atlas's enclosure was wide open, and the electronic lock hung broken on its hinges. I remembered that 15 minutes ago, a fire alarm had sounded throughout the zoo due to some electrical malfunction in the main power grid, and everyone had rushed to check if anything was wrong, and the automatic locks must have failed during the power surge. Before we get deep into the story, please subscribe, like, and comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hooked in and ready to enjoy the story? Because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. Atlas, that was the lion's name, had apparently simply pushed the door with his paw, and it opened, granting him freedom he'd never experienced in 12 years of captivity. But as I ran toward the central plaza, something caught my eye that made no sense. While everyone else fled in panic, one person remained perfectly still, an elderly woman sitting on a green bench near the flamingo exhibit, watching the approaching lion with what looked like recognition. I reached the central plaza just as Atlas cleared the decorative fountain, his powerful muscles propelling him forward with terrifying grace. My security team was already in position, Mike and Carlos with tranquilizer rifles raised, hands shaking, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cool afternoon air. "Sir," Mike shouted into his radio, "we have a clear shot. Permission to—" "Wait," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to give the order. "Just wait," because I couldn't stop staring at the woman on the bench. She was small, couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, wearing a floral dress that looked like something from another era. Her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her hands folded calmly over a worn leather handbag in her lap. She looked like someone's grandmother, like she should be at church or knitting in a rocking chair, not sitting perfectly still while 450 pounds of apex predator ran directly toward her. "Sir, we need to take the shot." Carlos's voice cracked with panic. "He's going to kill her." Atlas was 50 meters away, then 40, the distance closing with impossible speed. I tried to shout at the woman to run, but my voice wouldn't work, my hands frozen on the radio. Around me, the last stragglers were diving into buildings, vaulting over railings, doing anything to put distance between themselves and the lion. But she just sat there, watching, waiting. 30 meters, I could see Atlas's mane rippling in the wind, could see the power in every stride. This was an animal built to chase down zebras and bring down wildebeest. A human, especially an elderly, fragile human, wouldn't stand a chance. "Director Brennan!" Mike was screaming now. "We have to shoot! We have to—" "I said wait!" 20 meters. The woman still hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. She was smiling. Not with fear or resignation, but with something that looked absurdly like joy. "What is she doing?" Carlos whispered. "Why isn't she running?" 10 meters. Atlas's focus was locked on the woman like a laser sight. Every predatory instinct in his massive body pointed at that bench, at that impossibly calm figure who should have been the easiest prey he'd ever encountered. 5 meters. "Take the shot!" someone screamed. Maybe Mike, maybe me, I couldn't tell anymore. But before anyone could pull a trigger, Atlas began to slow. Not the cautious deceleration of a predator reconsidering its approach, but something else entirely. His gallop became a trot. His trot became a walk. His body language shifted from focused predation to something I'd never seen in 12 years of managing this zoo. Recognition. 3 meters from the bench, Atlas stopped completely. He stood there, massive and terrifying, his hot breath visible in the afternoon air, his amber eyes fixed on the elderly woman who still hadn't moved. The entire plaza had gone silent. Even the flamingos had stopped their usual racket. The only sound was my own heartbeat hammering in my ears and the soft crackle of radios as security teams across the zoo demanded updates, demanded orders, demanded someone tell them what the hell was happening. I couldn't answer them. I could barely breathe because I was watching something impossible unfold. The woman slowly extended her hand, not in fear or submission, but with the practiced ease of someone reaching out to pet a familiar cat. Her fingers trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion I couldn't tell, but her movement was deliberate, controlled. "Don't," I whispered, though I knew she couldn't hear me. "Please don't." Atlas's massive head lowered, not in preparation to strike, but in a gesture that made every textbook I'd ever read about lion behavior completely irrelevant. He pressed his forehead against her palm. The sound that emerged from his chest wasn't a roar or a growl. It was something softer, higher pitched, a sound I'd only ever heard lionesses make when greeting their cubs, a sound of family. "Hello, my beautiful boy," the woman said, her voice carrying across the silent plaza with perfect clarity. "I wondered if you'd remember me." My knees nearly gave out. Behind me, I heard someone's rifle clatter to the ground. Atlas's entire body seemed to melt. The apex predator, the king of beasts, the animal that had sent hundreds of people fleeing in primal terror, pressed his massive head into the woman's lap like a house cat seeking affection. And the woman, this impossible, fearless woman, stroked his mane with tears streaming down her weathered face. "I've missed you too," she whispered. "Every single day, I've missed you too." I stood there with my security team, weapons raised but completely forgotten, watching an elderly woman and a lion share a reunion that shouldn't exist, that defied every principle of animal behavior I'd ever studied, that transformed my understanding of what these animals remembered, what they felt, what they grieved for when it was taken away. "Sir," Mike said quietly, his voice shaking, What do we do?" I had no answer, because I'd spent 12 years as zoo director, 12 years managing these animals, 12 years thinking I understood the relationship between captive predators and the humans who kept them. And in 30 seconds, an elderly woman sitting on a bench had proven that I understood nothing at all. Atlas remained perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. His massive head rested in Cecilia's lap, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and rhythmic. The woman's hands moved through his mane with practiced gentleness, her fingers finding scars I'd never noticed before, old wounds from his time before the zoo, from the hell he'd endured as a cub. "You've grown so big," Cecilia whispered, her voice breaking. "Look at you. Look at how magnificent you've become." The lion's response was another one of those impossible sounds, that low, rumbling purr that vibrated through his entire body. I'd read about this in the literature, about how big cats could produce sounds similar to domestic cat purring, but through different mechanisms. But reading about it and witnessing it were entirely different things. This wasn't just vocalization, this was communication, this was love. "Sir," Carlos said quietly behind me, should we do something?" "No," I heard myself say. "Don't move, don't make a sound, just watch." Because what else could we do? Intervene? Separate them? Shoot a lion who was currently demonstrating more gentleness than I'd seen from most humans? Cecilia's tears fell onto Atlas's mane, darkening the tawny fur. "I'm so sorry," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm so sorry I couldn't keep you. I tried, baby. I tried so hard to find a way, but they said you needed more space, needed proper facilities, needed to be somewhere that could care for a grown lion. And I knew they were right, but it broke my heart. It broke my heart to let you go." Atlas shifted slightly, pressing harder against her, as if trying to get closer, trying to reassure her that he understood. His tail, which had been still, began to move, not the aggressive lashing of an agitated predator, but the gentle swaying of contentment. Around the plaza, I became aware of other sounds returning, distant sirens. Someone had called emergency services. The chatter of radios as zoo staff tried to figure out what was happening. The soft whir of security cameras capturing every second of this impossible reunion. This footage would be watched by millions, I realized, analyzed by animal behaviorists, debated by scientists, shared across social media until it became one of those viral moments that defined a generation's understanding of animal emotion. But right now, in this moment, it belonged only to them, an elderly woman and the lion she'd saved. Cecilia's hand moved to Atlas's face, gently touching the distinctive scar above his left eye. "You still have this," she said softly, "from the cage they kept you in. Do you remember? You were so small, so sick. The vet said you wouldn't make it through the week." The lion opened his eyes at her touch, those amber orbs focusing on her face with unmistakable recognition. Not the vague acknowledgement an animal might show toward a familiar scent, but specific, individual recognition. He knew her, not as a human or the feeding human or any other categorical designation. He knew Cecilia. He remembered her, and he'd come to find her the moment freedom allowed. "I came here every week," Cecilia continued, her voice steadier now. "Did you know that? I'd sit on this bench and watch you through the glass. Sometimes I thought you saw me too, thought you recognized me, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if I was just a foolish old woman projecting human emotions onto an animal who'd long forgotten me." Atlas made a sound then, a chuff, the greeting vocalization that lions used with pride members. It was deliberate, directed, undeniable in its meaning. "I am here. I remember. You are mine." "Oh," Cecilia breathed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Oh, my beautiful boy, you do remember." Behind me, I heard Mike's shaky voice. "How is this possible? How is any of this possible?" I shook my head, unable to answer. My entire career had been built on understanding animal behavior, on managing the relationship between captive wildlife and the humans who kept them. And in 30 seconds, an elderly woman sitting on a bench had proven that I understood nothing at all. It took another 45 minutes before we could safely guide Atlas back to a temporary holding area. Cecilia was the one who convinced him to go, her gentle words and patient coaxing more effective than any tranquilizer could have been. When she finally stood to leave, slowly, painfully, her aged joints protesting after sitting so long, Atlas followed her like a devoted dog until we reached the reinforced gate. Only then did she turn, place both hands on his massive face, and whisper something I couldn't hear before stepping back and letting us secure him. She refused medical attention, refused interview requests from the news crews that had somehow already gathered outside the zoo gates. She simply gave me her phone number, patted my hand with surprising strength, and said, "I'm sure you have questions, dear. Call me when you're ready to listen." Then she walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the greatest crisis of my career with absolutely no idea what had just happened. Back in my office, I pulled up Atlas's file with shaking hands. The basics I already knew. Male African lion, approximately 14 years old, arrived at Riverside Zoo 12 years ago from Clearwater Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The file noted he'd been partially socialized and had responded well to human contact during recovery. But that clinical language told me nothing about the bond I'd just witnessed. I picked up the phone and dialed Clearwater. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful and professional. "Clearwater Wildlife Rehabilitation, this is Diana speaking." "This is Todd Brennan, director of Riverside City Zoo. I need to speak to whoever was in charge 12 years ago about a lion cub you transferred to us." A pause. "That would still be me. Is there a problem with Atlas?" "No." "Yes. I don't know." I ran a hand through my hair. "There was an incident today. Atlas escaped his enclosure, and there was an elderly woman, Cecilia, I think, and he went straight to her, like he knew her, like he'd been searching for her." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then Diana's voice came back, softer now, weighted with emotion. "Cecilia Hartman? She didn't give me her last name, but... Oh my God, she found him. After all these years, she found him." My grip tightened on the phone. Tell me everything." Diana took a breath I could hear through the line. "Atlas came to us as a 4-month-old cub, worst case we'd ever seen. Animal control had seized him from a roadside attraction where they'd kept him in a dog crate. When he arrived, he was maybe 15 pounds, should have been close to 40. Malnourished, dehydrated, infected wounds all over his body from lying in his own waste. We didn't think he'd survive the night." I closed my eyes, imagining the tiny, broken cub that had grown into the magnificent animal I'd just witnessed. "Cecilia was one of our volunteers. She'd been coming in for years, helping with injured birds mostly, small mammals. But when Atlas arrived and we thought he was dying, she asked if she could sit with him, said every living thing deserved someone to hold their hand when they passed. But he didn't die. No, because Cecilia refused to let him." Diana's voice grew stronger. "She was there every single day for 6 months. Every single day, Todd. She bottle-fed that cub every 3 hours around the clock. When he developed pneumonia and the fever spiked, she stayed overnight, sleeping on the floor beside his cage, waking every hour to check on him. She talked to him constantly, read him books, told him stories, sang him lullabies." My throat tightened. Why didn't any of this make it into his transfer file? "Because by the time we transferred him, Cecilia had stopped coming. Diana paused. "She'd become too attached. We all knew it. Atlas would cry when she left, wouldn't eat unless she fed him. When he got big enough that keeping that bond became dangerous, our director at the time told Cecilia she needed to step back, for her own safety and for Atlas's development." "She walked away?" "She broke her own heart to give him a chance at a normal life, or as normal as captivity can be." Diana's voice cracked. "I remember the last day she came in. She sat with Atlas for 3 hours, just petting him and crying. Then she stood up, walked out, and never came back. I called her a few times to check in, but she always said the same thing. It's better this way. He needs to forget me." But he hadn't forgotten. 12 years in a zoo, surrounded by staff and visitors and routine, and Atlas had remembered the woman who saved his life when he was too small to understand what saving meant. "She visited the zoo?" I said slowly, pieces falling into place. "Every week she'd come and sit on a bench near his enclosure. I've seen her on security footage dozens of times. We thought she was just a regular who liked watching the lions." She was watching her son, the only child she ever had in the only way that mattered. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at Atlas's file. The clinical language, the medical records, the transfer documents, none of it captured the truth. None of it explained why a lion would break through chaos and panic to find one specific human, why he would submit to her touch without hesitation, why he would look at her with eyes that held not just recognition, but something that looked absurdly like love. I picked up my phone and dialed the number Cecilia had given me. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. "Hello, dear. Are you ready to listen now?" "Yes," I managed. "Yes, I am." "Good, because I have 12 years of stories to tell you about my beautiful boy, and I think it's time someone understood that the animal you've been keeping in that cage is more than just a lion. He's family, and family never forgets." I spent that entire night in the security office, scrolling through months of footage. My head of security, Maria, had pulled up every camera angle covering the big cat exhibit and the surrounding areas, creating a timeline that made my chest ache with each new discovery. "There," Maria said, pointing to the screen, "April 19th, 2:17 p.m. The footage showed Cecilia walking slowly down the main path, her cane tapping against the pavement, her movements careful but determined. She made her way to the same green bench, the one that Atlas had found, and settled there with the patient ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Go back," I said. "Show me earlier footage. How long has this been happening?" Maria's fingers flew across the keyboard. The dates rolled backwards, March, February, January. The footage was always the same. Cecilia arriving, sitting on that bench, staying for hours, then leaving as the zoo closed for the day. "Here's the earliest I can find," Maria said, pulling up footage from 13 months ago, June 3rd of last year. I watched Cecilia's first visit. She approached the bench hesitantly, as if unsure whether she had the right to be there. She sat for only 20 minutes that first time, her hands clutching her handbag, her body rigid with tension. But even in that short visit, I could see her eyes tracking towards the glass, searching for something, searching for her. "Pull up the exhibit cameras," I said. "Interior angles. I want to see Atlas during her visits." What Maria showed me next broke something inside my chest. The interior cameras captured Atlas's behavior during Cecilia's visits with perfect clarity. The moment she sat down on that bench, even though she was 50 meters away, even though solid walls and reinforced glass separated them, Atlas would stop whatever he was doing. His head would lift, his nostrils would flare, testing the air for a scent that shouldn't have been able to reach him through the ventilation system. Then he would move to the glass viewing area and wait. Not pacing, not agitated, just sitting in clear view of the public area, positioned so that if Cecilia looked up from her book, she would see him watching. "Jesus," Maria whispered, "how did we not notice this?" "Because we weren't looking," I said, my voice hollow. "We saw a lion doing what lions do, sitting, watching visitors. We saw an elderly woman doing what elderly people do, spending time at the zoo. We never connected them." But the cameras didn't lie. Every single visit, the same pattern. Cecilia would arrive, Atlas would position himself at the glass. They would maintain that vigil, sometimes for hours, until she left. And after she was gone, Atlas would remain at the viewing window for another 10 to 15 minutes, as if hoping she might return. "Pull up the day of the escape," I said. "I want to see everything leading up to it." The footage from that afternoon was damning in its clarity. The alarm sounded at 2:43 p.m., a malfunction in the electrical system that sent warning signals through every building. The automatic locks, designed to secure all animal enclosures during emergencies, had failed due to the power surge. But Atlas hadn't immediately bolted from his enclosure when the lock released. The interior cameras showed him pacing, agitated by the alarms, stressed by the disruption to his routine. He'd pushed against the door, testing it perhaps, or simply displaced anxiety manifesting as physical action. When it opened, he'd paused, stood in the doorway, looked back at his enclosure as if questioning whether this freedom was real. Then something changed. His head lifted, nostrils flaring. He was scenting the air, searching for something specific. "Track his route," I said. "Show me every camera angle from the moment he left the enclosure." Maria stitched together the footage from multiple cameras, creating a continuous path. Atlas had run, not randomly, not in panic, but with purpose. He'd ignored the zebra enclosure where visitors had been gathered, had bypassed the cafe where the scent of food should have attracted a predator's attention, had run straight past the gift shop where a family had been hiding. He'd gone directly to the central plaza, to the bench, to where Cecilia sat every week during her visits. "Check the entrance cameras," I said, my heart hammering. Was she already here when the alarm went off? Maria pulled up the entrance footage. There was Cecilia, passing through the gates at 1:52 p.m., almost an hour before the electrical failure. She'd been sitting on that bench, in her usual spot, in her usual visit, when the chaos erupted. He was looking for her, I breathed. The alarm stressed him. The door opened and he went searching for the one thing that made him feel safe and loved. Maria nodded slowly. He wasn't escaping. He was trying to get to her. I thought about all the emergency protocols we'd developed over the years, all the scenarios we'd planned for, escaped animals, aggressive behavior, attack situations, but we'd never considered this, that a captive lion might break free not to hunt or to flee, but to find comfort, to seek out the one human who represented safety and love in a life otherwise defined by walls and routine. "Pull up her last visit before today," I said quietly. The footage showed Cecilia arriving the previous Thursday, sitting on her bench for 3 hours as usual, but this time I noticed something new. Several times she'd stood and walked closer to the viewing glass, close enough that if Atlas had been right on the other side, they would have been separated by inches instead of meters. The interior cameras showed Atlas matching her movements, positioning himself directly opposite her each time. At one point, Cecilia had placed her palm flat against the glass. Atlas had pressed his massive paw against the same spot from the inside. The glass between them was 4 inches thick, designed to withstand the force of a charging lion, but in that moment, it might as well have been tissue paper for all the separation it provided. They'd been reaching for each other for months, through glass, through distance, through all the barriers humans had constructed between captive wildlife and the people who loved them. And when those barriers finally failed, Atlas knew exactly where to go. Cecilia returned to the zoo the day after the incident, and every day after that for the next 2 years. I found her on the same bench that first morning, sitting with her hands folded over her handbag, watching the temporary holding area where we'd secured Atlas while his enclosure underwent emergency repairs and safety upgrades. "May I join you?" I asked. She patted the bench beside her. "I was hoping you would." I sat, and for several minutes we simply watched Atlas together. He was pacing, not the agitated, stressed pacing I'd seen in other big cats, but something more purposeful. Every few circuits he'd pause and look toward where Cecilia sat, as if confirming she was still there. "Tell me about when he was small," I said. Cecilia smiled, her weathered face transforming with the memory. "He fit in my arms," Can you imagine? That magnificent creature was once small enough that I could cradle him while I bottle-fed him. He had these enormous paws even then. We all knew he'd grow to be massive, but the rest of him was just skin and bones. She pulled a photograph from her handbag, its edges worn from handling. The image showed a much younger Cecilia holding a tiny lion cub, its ribs visible through patchy fur, its eyes dull with illness. But even in the photo, I could see the distinctive markings, the scar above the left eye that Atlas still carried. The first night, I thought I'd be sitting vigil at his death, Cecilia continued quietly. The vet had given him maybe 12 hours, but every time I started to leave thinking he was gone, he'd take another breath, just one more, and then another, like he was fighting just because someone was there to witness it. So you stayed? I stayed for 6 months. She tucked the photo away carefully. My daughter thought I was crazy, said I was too old to be spending nights on rehabilitation center floors. But how could I leave? He'd fought so hard to stay alive. The least I could do was fight alongside him. Over the following weeks, Cecilia's daily presence became as routine as the morning rounds. She'd arrive at opening, claim her bench, and spend hours watching Atlas through whatever barrier currently separated them. And she'd talk. To me, to other staff members who stopped to check on her, sometimes just to Atlas himself, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "You need to expand the habitat," she said one afternoon, her tone gentle but firm. "He needs more space to roam, more enrichment. He's brilliant, you know. He gets bored easily." I'd started to argue. Budget constraints, structural limitations, but the look she gave me stopped the words in my throat. "I understand you have challenges, dear, but not an exhibit. He's not a display for visitors to photograph. He's an individual with thoughts and feelings and memories that stretch back to the worst moments of his life. If we're going to keep him in captivity, we owe him more than the minimum." She was right. I knew she was right, and over the next months I found myself redesigning Atlas's habitat with Cecilia as my consultant. She advocated for climbing structures that would challenge him, for scent enrichment that would engage his hunting instincts, for better temperature regulation in his indoor spaces. He used to love the heat lamps, she told me. When he was sick, he'd position himself right under them and just soak up the warmth. I think it reminded him of sunbathing, even though he'd never actually done that in the wild. Every suggestion came from intimate knowledge of Atlas as an individual, not as a species. She didn't talk about lions in general. She talked about Atlas specifically, his preferences, his personality, his quirks. "He's afraid of thunderstorms," she mentioned during one visit. "Has been ever since he was a cub. The first time one hit while he was at the rehabilitation center, he tried to climb into my lap, all 40 pounds of him, desperate for comfort. I held him for 3 hours until it passed." I started paying attention differently after that, started noticing how Atlas would retreat to his indoor den when storms approached, how he'd pace more during loud events at the zoo, how he'd visibly relax when certain staff members approached, but tense around others. He wasn't just the lion in Enclosure 3, he was Atlas, an individual shaped by specific experiences, carrying specific traumas, capable of specific joys. One afternoon, after Atlas's renovated habitat had been completed, Cecilia stood at the new viewing area and wept. "It's beautiful," she said. "He has room to run now, room to choose where he wants to be." Atlas, as if understanding the moment, bounded across the expanded space, his powerful body finally able to stretch into a full gallop. He leapt onto the new climbing structure, surveyed his enlarged territory, then looked directly at where Cecilia sat. The rumble that emerged from his chest carried across the habitat: recognition, approval, gratitude. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked Cecilia one day. "Spending all those months saving him, then losing him, having to watch him through glass instead of being able to touch him?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that he has to be captive at all," she said finally. "I regret that humans damaged him so badly that he could never survive in the wild. But regret loving him? Regret giving him a chance at life?" She shook her head. "Never. Some loves are worth the heartbreak, Todd. Some connections matter more than the pain they cause." I thought about that often in the months that followed. Thought about it every time I saw Cecilia on her bench, maintaining her vigil. Every time I watched Atlas position himself at the viewing glass, waiting for her arrival. Every time I witnessed their ritual, her hand on the glass, his paw pressed against the other side, separated by inches and connected by something that transcended the barrier completely. Cecilia was teaching me that conservation wasn't just about species preservation or genetic diversity. It was about honoring the individual lives we'd taken responsibility for, about seeing each animal not as a representative of their species, but as a unique being deserving of dignity, respect, and love. And Atlas, through his unwavering devotion to the elderly woman who had saved him, was teaching me that animals remembered kindness with a depth and permanence that humans often underestimated. Some bonds, I was learning, weren't broken by time or barriers or the limitations of language. Some bonds simply existed, undeniable and eternal, asking only to be witnessed and honored. Cecilia didn't come to the zoo on a Tuesday in late September. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was 84, after all, entitled to days when her body simply wouldn't cooperate. But when Wednesday came and went with no sign of her, I felt the first stirrings of worry. Thursday morning, her daughter called. "Mom passed away Monday night," Sarah said, her voice thick with grief. "Peacefully, in her sleep. The doctor said her heart just stopped." I sat down hard in my office chair, the phone pressed against my ear, unable to form words. I'd known this day would come, had known that Cecilia's daily visits couldn't last forever, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were entirely different things. "She left instructions," Sarah continued, "about the zoo, about Atlas. She made me promise to tell you personally." The will was extensive, detailed, and heartbreaking in its specificity. Cecilia had left her entire estate, a surprisingly substantial amount from her years as a librarian and careful investor, to Riverside City Zoo, but the funds came with conditions. "The money is to be used exclusively for habitat improvements and enrichment programs," the lawyer read aloud in my office a week later. "Priority is to be given to creating naturalistic environments that honor the emotional and psychological needs of captive animals, with particular attention to species capable of forming lasting bonds with humans." There was more, much more. Specifications about minimum space requirements, enrichment schedules, staff training on animal emotional welfare. It read less like a legal document and more like a love letter to every animal who'd ever been damaged by human cruelty and given a second chance. And at the end, a personal note in Cecilia's handwriting. "Todd, dear, I trust you to use this gift wisely. Help them remember that the animals in your care are not decorations or entertainment. They are individuals with memories and feelings and the capacity for love that transcends what science has yet learned to measure. Honor that. Always." I sat in the lawyer's office with tears streaming down my face, holding a document that represented everything Cecilia had valued, everything she'd fought for, everything she'd taught me in 2 years of daily conversations on a bench. Atlas knew before I told him. I'd planned to visit his habitat that afternoon, to somehow explain to a lion that the woman who'd saved his life was gone. But when I arrived at the viewing area, Atlas was already there. Not in his usual position near the glass where Cecilia would press her hand, but staring at the empty bench where she'd sat every day for 2 years. He'd been there since morning, according to the staff. Hadn't moved, hadn't eaten the breakfast offering, just stood at the glass, focused on that empty bench with an intensity that made my chest ache. "He knows," Maria said quietly beside me. "Somehow, he knows." Over the following days, Atlas's behavior deteriorated in ways that no amount of veterinary intervention could address. He refused food, not all of it, but enough that we started to worry about his health. He spent hours at the viewing glass, always watching that bench, as if Cecilia would materialize through sheer force of will. And he started performing behaviors I'd only seen documented in wild lions who'd lost pride members. He'd pick up dust in his mouth and blow it out in soft clouds, a mourning ritual that scientists believed was lions' way of scenting the deceased, of confirming they were truly gone. He'd pace in patterns that mimicked patrol routes, as if searching for something lost. At night, the security cameras caught him lying near the glass, his massive head on his paws, staring at that empty bench in the darkness. "Should we move the bench?" one of the junior staff suggested. "Maybe if it's not there, he won't—" "No," I said firmly. "We leave it exactly where it is." Because removing the bench wouldn't ease Atlas's grief, it would just take away the one tangible reminder of where Cecilia had been, where their connection had been maintained through glass and determination and love that refused to be diminished by barriers. 3 weeks after Cecilia's death, I stood at the viewing glass and did something I'd never done before. I spoke to Atlas directly, not as a zoo director managing an asset, but as one grieving being to another. "She loved you," I said, my voice breaking. "Every day she loved you, and she made sure you'd be taken care of, that you'd have the best possible life we can give you. She made me promise, Atlas, and I'm going to keep that promise." The lion's ear twitched toward my voice. He didn't move from his vigil, didn't acknowledge me with eye contact, but I saw his chest expand in a deep breath, as if my words had reached him in some way. "I miss her too," I whispered. That afternoon, I authorized the first major construction using Cecilia's bequest. We'd be doubling Atlas's habitat size, adding natural swimming pools, creating elevated platforms where he could survey his territory like the king he'd never gotten to be in the wild. It would take months to complete, but every day of construction, I made sure Atlas could see the activity, could understand that changes were happening, that Cecilia's love for him was being translated into space and freedom and dignity. The day they installed the memorial plaque on the bench, "In loving memory of Cecilia Hartman, who taught us that some bonds transcend species and that love is the greatest gift we can offer those we keep in captivity," Atlas finally moved from his vigil at the glass. He approached the fence nearest the bench, as close as the barriers allowed, and pressed his face against the chain link. The rumble that emerged was low, mournful, unmistakably grief. But it was also acknowledgement, recognition that something had changed, that Cecilia was being honored in the only way humans knew how, with words carved in stone and promises made in her name. I stood at the bench, my hand on the cool metal of the plaque, and understood that Cecilia's final gift wasn't just the money or the improved habitats. It was teaching us that the animals we kept deserved to be mourned when they lost someone they loved, just as we mourned when we lost them, and that sometimes the most profound thing we could do for a grieving animal was simply witness their grief and honor it as real. The dedication ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in late spring, exactly 18 months after Cecilia's death. The new habitat was complete, 5 times the size of Atlas's original enclosure, with natural rock formations, a waterfall that fed into a swimming pool, elevated platforms that gave him choices about where to be and what to see. It was everything Cecilia had envisioned, funded entirely by her estate, built as a monument to one woman's belief that captive animals deserved dignity. Nearly 200 people had gathered for the ceremony. Zoo staff, board members, local officials, conservationists, and Cecilia's daughter Sarah, who stood near the front with tears already streaming down her face. The media was there too, cameras ready to capture the moment when we'd unveil the habitat that had captured international attention since the viral video of Atlas and Cecilia's reunion. But my eyes kept drifting to Atlas. He was in the new habitat, exploring the expanded space with what looked like cautious wonder. Every few minutes he'd pause and look toward where the crowd had gathered, toward the bench that still bore Cecilia's memorial plaque, now surrounded by flowers left by visitors who'd been touched by their story. I stepped up to the podium, my prepared speech suddenly feeling inadequate for the moment. 18 months ago, I began, my voice carrying across the crowd, this zoo experienced what should have been our worst nightmare. A fully grown lion escaped his enclosure during peak visitor hours. People fled in terror. My security team prepared to shoot, and I stood watching, certain I was about to witness a tragedy that would define the rest of my career. I paused, looking out at the faces watching me. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was something I didn't have the education or experience to understand. What happened was a reunion between an elderly woman named Cecilia Hartman and the lion cub she'd saved 12 years earlier. A cub who had grown into a magnificent predator, but who'd never forgotten the human who'd loved him back to life. Sarah was openly crying now. Several other people in the crowd wiped at their eyes. For 2 years after that day, Cecilia came to this zoo every single day. She sat on that bench and she maintained a bond with Atlas that transcended every barrier we'd built between them. She taught me, forced me really, to see Atlas not as an exhibit or an attraction, but as an individual, as someone with memories and preferences and the capacity for love that transcends what science has yet to learn to measure. I looked at the bench, at the plaque that bore Cecilia's name. When Cecilia passed away, she left her entire estate to this zoo, not because she thought we were doing everything right, but because she believed we could do better. She believed that if we're going to keep animals in captivity, if we're going to take away their freedom for the sake of conservation or education, then we owe them more than the minimum. We owe them dignity. We owe them recognition of their emotional lives. We owe them the acknowledgement that they remember who loved them, and they grieve when that love is taken away. Atlas had stopped exploring. He stood on one of the elevated platforms, his gaze fixed on the crowd, on the bench, on the place where Cecilia had maintained her vigil. This habitat, I continued, gesturing to the expanded space behind me, is Cecilia's final gift to Atlas and to all the animals in our care. But her greater gift was teaching us to see, to really see, not lions in general, but Atlas specifically. Not elderly visitors in general, but Cecilia, a woman who gave 6 months of her life to save a dying cub, who spent 2 years maintaining a bond across glass and distance, who used her last act on earth to ensure that the animals we keep captive are treated as the individuals they are. She wrote, "Help them remember that the animals in your care are not decorations or entertainment. They are individuals with memories and feelings and the capacity for love that transcends what science has yet to learn to measure." My voice broke on the last words, but I pushed through. Cecilia and Atlas proved something that shouldn't have been possible. They proved that bonds formed in trauma can survive years of separation. They proved that animals remember kindness with a permanence that humans often underestimate. They proved that sometimes the most profound thing we could do for a grieving animal was simply witness their grief and honor it as real.
Every boundary nature and humanity could create, connected by something stronger than any of those barriers. I looked directly at Atlas. who was still watching from his platform. Cecilia asked me to keep a promise, to honor the emotional lives of the animals we keep, to never forget that behind every scientific name and species designation is an individual who deserves to be seen. I nodded to Maria, who stood by the ceremonial ribbon marking the habitat's official opening. This habitat is dedicated to Cecilia Hartman, who taught us that love doesn't stop at species boundaries, that memory doesn't fade with time, and that the greatest gift we can offer captive animals is the recognition that they are not things to be managed, but lives to be honored. As Maria cut the ribbon, the crowd applauded, but I kept my eyes on Atlas. He descended from his platform and moved to the section of the habitat closest to the bench. He couldn't reach it, the barriers remained between them, but he positioned himself as close as the new design allowed, in the spot where he'd stood during those 2 years of daily visits. And he rumbled, that low, distinctive sound that I'd learned to recognize as his way of communicating comfort, recognition, connection. The crowd fell silent, everyone turning to look at the lion who seemed to be acknowledging the ceremony, acknowledging the habitat built in honor of the woman who'd saved him. Sarah approached me after the ceremony, her face wet with tears. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for seeing what my mother saw, for honoring what they meant to each other." "I didn't have a choice," I said honestly. "She made it impossible to look away." We stood together at the bench, reading the plaque that would outlive us all. Cecilia Hartman, 1935 to 2019. She taught us that some bonds transcend species, that love is the greatest gift we can offer those we keep in captivity, and that the animals behind glass remember who loved them, always. Atlas remained at his post, watching the bench, maintaining the vigil that Cecilia had begun and that he would continue for the rest of his life. Because some loves don't end with death. Some bonds remain, carved in memory and stone and the daily ritual of a lion who refused to forget the woman who'd given him everything. Her time, her patience, her belief that he was worth saving. And in return, Atlas had given Cecilia and all of us proof that the animals we keep are capable of love so profound it reshapes how we understand consciousness, emotion, and the boundaries between human and wild. That bench would remain forever, a monument to an impossible love story. And Atlas would remain beside it, watching, keeping faith, keeping the memory of Cecilia Hartman alive in the only way a lion could, through loyalty that never wavered, through recognition that never faded, through love that death itself couldn't diminish.
We appreciate you seeing the entire story. You will definitely enjoy the following story if you liked this one. As you may imagine, it's more bizarre and fascinating. To view the next one, click on the image that is currently displayed on the screen.